So in a masterstroke of hypocrisy, the notorious "you wouldn't steal a car" anti-piracy PSA used a pirated font. Piracy, It's a Crime was a 2004 campaign from the MPAA that became ubiquitous throughout the DVD era, auto-playing before the feature on many rental and retail DVDs. It's been widely parodied and lived on as a meme for over 2 decades. But now a new layer of irony has emerged regarding the typography. FF Confidential was identified as the font used by the campaign, but recently sleuths on Blue Sky looking at the campaign website found the font embedded in PDFs was not a properly licensed version, but a pirated knockoff called XBand Rough, which was distributed on dubious free font sites. To appreciate the irony, let's first examine the legitimate font, FF Confidential, before diving into the murky waters of font piracy. FF stands for Font, a digital type foundry founded in 1990 by type designers Neville Brody and Eric Spiekermann. They were known for their display fonts and especially their popular distressed, distorted, and grungy typefaces, like FF Blur, designed by Brody himself. FF Confidential was released as part of a font collection called FF Instant Types by designer Just van Rossum. These were created by scanning and digitizing lettering found in the wild, like on the side of a crate or out of an old school label maker, or for FF Confidential, letters made by rubber stamp. The imperfections and gritty texture from the unevenly inked letters was very much the point. It was perfectly on trend with the grunge aesthetic that was hugely popular in graphic design between the 90s and early 2000s. And the anti-piracy PSA has all the hallmarks of the trend, the choppy editing and the bleach bypass color grading down to the in-your-face typography. FF Confidential perfectly fits this edgy aesthetic. In fact, you might also recognize it from the opening titles of this iconic early 2000s show, Alias. So where did this bootleg font XBand Rough come from? The name points to XBand, a 1990s modem-based gaming service run by a company called Catapult. Inspecting the font file reveals Catapult mentioned in the copyright information. The most plausible explanation is that someone associated with XBand created an unauthorized and renamed copy of FF Confidential, perhaps for internal use. It wasn't intended to be distributed, but somehow found its way onto free font websites. The deeper backstory for now remains lost to history. So is this the most ironic case of font piracy ever? Well, that depends on how you define piracy when it comes to fonts. We'll have to leave a full legal breakdown for another video, but in short, fonts don't have the same kinds of copyright protections as some other designs. For example, Disney owns Star Wars, including both the artwork for the film posters and the Star Wars logo itself. Their lawyers will happily hurl you into a sarlacc pit for reproducing and selling either. However, you could totally make a font based on the lettering of the Star Wars logo, and as long as you didn't mention Star Wars in the name, you would be free to sell that online without fear of the mouse's lawyers. And in fact, people have done exactly that. Why? Because letter forms are generally not considered artistic works under US copyright law. They are seen as functional objects. Fonts do have some protections, however. The font file itself, .ttf, .otf, etc., is protected as software. You can't just rename the exact file and resell it. Likewise, you can trademark a font name like Helvetica. Design patents also exist, though they have a limited term and are difficult to enforce, making them uncommon for typefaces. While stronger IP laws for fonts exist in other countries, US law has a major influence, especially in the age of digital distribution. Consequently, font clones, bootlegs, and blatant piracy are rampant. Opportunists and bad actors blatantly rip off designs and sell them under different names for a quick buck. But these are usually reported and removed on legitimate font marketplaces relatively quickly. However, to find perhaps the most ironic case of font piracy, we need to look at the early career of one of typography's most celebrated figures. This is Matthew Carter. You'll probably recognize the fonts Verdana and Georgia as some of his work, as well as many other highly regarded typefaces. He has also designed the font and logo type for Yale University, has numerous honorary titles, and may be the most celebrated living type designer. However, there are some parts of his early career you'll find less likely to be disclosed in career retrospectives. Now, I'm about to spill some niche tea, and to be perfectly clear up front, I am not making any personal allegations in this section. Instead, I'll be summarizing claims that have circulated the small world of type design for some years. Understandably, when these claims concern one of the most venerated and influential figures in the field, they've mostly been whispered rather than shouted from the rooftops. But one man has been notably vocal, Mr. Ulrich Stiel of Heidelberg, staking and meticulously detailing his allegations online. While Mr. Stiel isn't alone in his position, he's somewhat of a peripheral figure in the world of type, perhaps best described as a passionate, independent investigator rather than a traditional authoritative source. His website is an amazing time capsule, obsessively cataloging various cases of what he terms forgery, cloning, piracy, and plagiarism of fonts. His critiques extend beyond Mr. Carter to alleged plagiarists across the industry. It's fair to say he has a strong perspective on these matters, and that's worth bearing in mind. With that context, I will be summarizing some of Stiel's allegations against Mr. Carter and the foundry which he co-founded, Bitstream. Now, Carter worked for some time at Linotype, a very historic type foundry. In 1981, he and another colleague, Mike Parker, left Linotype together to found Bitstream, one of the first all-digital type foundries. Bitstream was prolific, quickly growing a collection of fonts numbering in the thousands. But according to Stiel, the vast majority of these were not original designs, but clones of the Linotype collection. Some of the most famous Linotype fonts like Helvetica, Eurosteel, and Univer were duplicated and released by Bitstream under alternate names, allegedly after being turned down by Linotype to license the designs. Bitstream was a disruptor ahead of its time. While early digital font families could be sold on floppy disk for upwards of $50 each, by the mid-90s, Bitstream became infamous for selling a CD of 500 fonts for just $45, hugely undercutting Linotype and other legacy type foundries. Much of this collection was also distributed for free with the Corel Draw suite, a Windows-based alternative to Adobe's Illustrator and Photoshop, which became massively popular in niches like sign writing and also in developing markets where the software package was widely pirated. Bitstream therefore became one of the major origin points of bootleg versions of historically significant and very popular commercial fonts, well before the mainstream adoption of the internet. According to Stiel's analysis, at one point about 90% of the Bitstream collection were forgeries of Linotype designs, which covered about half of the entire Linotype catalog at the time. But because of the legal grey area around copying font designs, remember, the lettering shapes themselves aren't copyrightable, this was all technically legal. They didn't lift any code, they digitized all these designs from scratch themselves. In fact, the clones were often technically as good or better than the digital versions published by Linotype. However, this business practice was far from universally praised. As type designer John Hudson put it plainly,
"I have said it before and I will say it again. I think the development of the original Bitstream library was one of the worst instances of piracy in the history of type, and it has set the tone for the disrespect for type shown today."
But wait, you might say, that's an impressive scale of piracy, sure, but it doesn't sound particularly ironic, don't you think? Yeah, I really do think, but here's what's truly ironic. A few years later, a company called SWFTE, or Swifty, also decided it would be great to sell CDs full of fonts at bargain bin prices. Allegedly, Swifty made their fonts by simply copying and renaming fonts from foundries like Bitstream. So, Bitstream sued them for bootlegging their bootleg fonts. The case was settled out of court and Swifty went out of business shortly thereafter, but that might actually be the most ironic case of font piracy ever. Swifty, though, was hardly unique. Throughout the 1990s, various publishers embraced a shovelware approach. Essentially, this meant shoveling massive quantities of digital content, things like shareware games, clip art collections, or fonts, onto cheap, mass-produced CDs with little regard for quality, curation, or even, in many cases, proper licensing. These publishers went on a spree helping themselves to the work of both small indie type designers and established foundries alike, leading to CDs boasting 500, 1,000, even 5,000 fonts sold for ever cheaper prices. This created a race to the bottom in the font market, and while Bitstream might not have started the trend, their business model certainly poured fuel on the fire. Fast forward to 2007, Monotype acquired Linotype, and a few years later also decided it would buy Bitstream. Which is why today, somewhat amusingly, you can buy both the original Linotype fonts and their Bitstream clones directly from the same company. Font piracy was certainly bad during the CD-ROM era, but the rise of the internet didn't exactly improve things. Unlike movies or even MP3s, font files were relatively small and quick to download, even on dial-up connections. This meant not only was peer-to-peer sharing rampant, but illegal font download sites like the ones distributing XBand Rough were also easy to set up. Revenue from online banner ads was more than enough to cover the minimal costs of hosting knockoff fonts or straight-up illegal copies. All these digital shenanigans might lead you to believe that font piracy was purely a product of the modern age, but a digital font's greatest weakness is also its greatest strength. Font files are easy to copy, but they're also easy to distribute globally. That's quite unlike, say, boxes filled with thousands of small lead blocks, which is what fonts literally were for centuries. During the era of metal type foundries were generally very local businesses, because shipping such a heavy product was impractical. It was very common for a best-selling type design in one market, say Germany, to suddenly have an imitator appear for sale in London, or a popular British design might find a duplicate being sold in America. A great example is Clarendon, a typeface designed in London in 1845. It was copied so quickly and so widely that the original foundry, Besley & Co., published this wonderfully Victorian screed in response.
Piracy is the great sin of all manufacturing communities. There is scarcely any trade in which it prevails so generally as among type founders. Messrs. Besley & Co. originally introduced the Clarendon character, but no sooner was the time of copyright expired than the trade was inundated with all sorts of piracies and imitations, some of them mere effigies of letters. Notwithstanding this, nearly all of the respectable printers in town and country who claim to have either taste or judgment have adopted the original fonts and treated the imitations with the contempt they deserve.
To me, a pretty clear pattern emerges. Every time there's a massive technological shift, intellectual property rights suddenly and very conveniently become a blind spot. Of course, there's a wide spectrum from shameless plagiarism to legitimate tribute or revival. And while the divide may be black and white for Ulrich Stiel, unfortunately for most people it's not always so clear-cut. On one hand, some of the best fonts available today are fresh interpretations of classic designs. Take Job Clarendon by David Jonathan Ross, a riff on that 1845 design with extended weights and open-type features that were technically impossible in Besley's time. One key factor here is attribution. It acknowledges its roots and frames itself as an homage, not passing itself off as something new and original. The Bitstream story sits at the uncomfortable end of the spectrum. Carter's partner Mike Parker wasn't just anyone at Linotype. He was director of typographic development, essentially the curator of their entire type library.
Matt did all the design work, and I ran the show as to what was to be designed. The result was history. It was the big Linotype library. The change came with Effie Arazi, who was building the first machines for mechanizing all imagery. And he needed a digital type library. As we walked home, having signed the agreement, we had our own company. The hell with Linotype.
Arazi bankrolled the development of the Bitstream library upfront. His company, Cytex, was on the cutting edge of a new wave of digital imaging and had no use for dinosaur incumbents like Linotype, whose business model bundled fonts and their physical equipment together. He correctly saw the future of fonts was as software, and by effectively poaching Parker and Carter, Bitstream was able to jumpstart that transition, rapidly transferring well-known typefaces to the new software paradigm. The controversy around Bitstream isn't whether the cloning happened. The evidence there is plain. The question is whether this was fair play or something which should be a blight on the record of these hugely venerated figures among type designers, whether what they did permanently undermined the value of original type designs from that point forward. They certainly couldn't feign ignorance. Mike Parker was core to the publishing and popularizing of Helvetica while at Linotype, but had no qualms about selling a duplicate under a new name. He also made loud and fairly controversial claims of plagiarism against Stanley Morrison of having stolen the design of Times New Roman from the work of Starling Burgess. Carter clearly understands the difference between revival and cloning. He designed ITC Galliard, which was hugely celebrated as an exemplar of thoughtful reinterpretation of designs by the 16th century punch cutter Robert Granion. He himself was quick to draw the distinction in an interview.
You know, in reviving a face like Grandjohn's or reviving a style like Grandjohn's, I've been accused of copying someone else's work. I don't really see it as copying. I see it as continuation.
Sure.
And I feel very, humble doing that, but rather proud at the same time.
Defenders of Bitstream might point out that the industry was at a turning point and Linotype was clinging to an outdated business model. Bitstream even worked with some of the original designers behind the scenes. They might argue that translating a font from analog to digital was so transformative that licensing a name was more a matter of business rivalry than of morality. And there's the argument that by making these designs more widely available and affordable, Bitstream democratized typography for the era of desktop publishing and the home computer. The reason I've spotlighted Carter in this video is not because his hands are uniquely dirty. There's hardly a major player in the type industry from the 20th century without some uncredited inspiration in their past. Bitstream was simply lightning in a bottle, the perfect intersection between commercial interest, shifting technology, and undeniable talent that enabled something monumental. Depending who you ask, a jumpstart to a new age in type design, or an Ocean's 11 style heist, or perhaps both. This raises the question, is it only considered piracy if the people who do it lack resources and respectability? When fly-by-night shovelware vendors copied fonts, that was outright theft. But when towering figures of the industry do the same thing at scale, well, that's just disruption or savvy business. Today, as debate rages on about generative AI trained on copyright work without permission or compensation, these feel like important questions. Will today's tech bros backed by billions in venture capital also eventually sanitize their origin stories? Will we look back in half a century and dismiss these concerns about training data as merely teething pains of a technological revolution? Do the ends justify the means, regardless of who gets harmed directly or indirectly along the way? Ultimately, history has a way of exposing ironies, just like the anti-piracy campaign that started this story. Because regardless of how we draw the line between inspiration and theft, I think there's one thing we can all agree on, including the designer of FF Confidential, Just van Rossum. An anti-piracy campaign using a pirated font, that's pretty hilarious. Piracy and typography have a long shared history, and here I've only really scratched the surface. It's one of the weird byproducts of how design is often shaped by business models and financial incentives like the cost of font licensing. Today, there's a whole spectrum of commercial models around font licensing ranging from traditional commercial fonts and bespoke corporate typefaces to free open licensed options. A fascinating case is how the font Nebula Sans was created. After using the commercial font Whitney, the licensing fee structure changed when its foundry, Heffler & Co., was acquired by Monotype. Rather than commission a completely new bespoke font from scratch or switch to a free, off-the-rack option, the team chose a hybrid made-to-measure approach. They worked with the open licensed source sans font to create a custom version that would closely fit the metrics of Whitney as a drop-in replacement. And like getting a made-to-measure suit, they added a few tailor-made details to make it distinctly their own. The whole story has been beautifully presented as a mini documentary, including interviews with the Nebula team and Paul Hunt, the typeface designer behind Source Sans. It's available to stream right now, and alongside it you'll find an exclusive bonus breakdown video from me diving into some of the things we discussed in this video and some of the unexpected connections that were mentioned in the documentary. Both are available only on, of course, Nebula, the prestige independent streaming service built by creators. If you enjoy what I do here on this channel, you'll find even more fantastic content from other great creators to satisfy your design curiosity. You can watch our videos ad-free, often days before they appear elsewhere, plus get bonus material like extended cuts, companion videos, and interviews, alongside a growing library of original shows, documentaries, and movies. For instance, one exclusive series you might enjoy is Great Cities by City Beautiful, which even has an episode all about the design contest behind Australia's capital city, Canberra. Using my link to sign up will get you a 40% discount on a yearly subscription, which comes out to $36 a year, $3 a month, which is frankly the best deal in streaming. But we also have monthly plans, a lifetime plan, and even gift cards. If you're interested in supporting this channel and getting access to the fastest growing collection of thoughtful content from independent creators, check it out at the link below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.